Chapter 1. The Beginnings of Mankind and the Significance of the Stone Age. If you look at the history of mankind, the Stone Age occupies a very special position. It is the oldest and longest epoch in human history, which stretched over millions of years. During this time, humans developed from early ancestors who still closely resembled animals to cultures that were already engaged in agriculture, domesticated animals, and established the first permanent settlements. Everything we see today as the basis of human culture, language, tools, art, religion, community life, has its origins in the Stone Age. Without this epoch, the development of civilization as we know it would be inconceivable. The Stone Age begins with the first signs that our early ancestors began to consciously make and use tools. This step marks the crucial difference between humans and animals. Although some animals also use tools, such as monkeys or birds, humans developed a tradition of tool-making that was passed on from generation to generation and was constantly refined. With this ability, the path to civilization began. The Stone Age era is divided into three major periods: the Paleolithic, the Mesolithic, and the Neolithic. The Paleolithic period, also known as the Paleolithic, ranges from the earliest tool finds around 2.5 million years ago to about 10,000 BC. It was shaped by life as a hunter and gatherer, by the use of fire, and the first forms of art and symbolism. The Mesolithic age was a transitional period in which people still hunted and gathered, but were already beginning to settle down. Finally, the Neolithic age marked the so-called Neolithic revolution, the transition to agriculture, livestock breeding, and permanent settlements. With it, the Stone Age ends and the path to the Bronze Age begins. The importance of the Stone Age lies not only in the fact that it represents the origin of our culture, but also in its duration. Almost 99% of human history to date has taken place in the Stone Age. All the great developments that made man what he is today began in this epoch. The use of tools, the use of fire, the development of language and communication, the emergence of art and religion, all these are achievements of the Stone Age people. Another central aspect is that the Stone Age formed the basis for man's adaptability. Early humans had to learn to survive in a wide variety of environments, from tropical Africa to the icy tundras of northern Europe during the Ice Age. This ability to adapt to a wide variety of habitats was only possible because they were able to make tools, organize themselves, and pass on knowledge. The Stone Age was thus a school of survival, the lessons of which continue to have an impact on human behavior today. The cultural dimension of the Stone Age is also particularly fascinating. The first traces of art, such as the famous cave paintings of Lascaux or Altamira, show that early humans were more than mere survivors. They had a need for expression, for symbolism, and perhaps also for spirituality. These works of art are testimonies to a way of thinking that went beyond the purely practical. They point to ideas of the world, nature, and transcendence that were later developed further in religions and philosophies. However, the Stone Age was not only an era of progress, but also a time of harsh living conditions. Hunger, cold, disease, and wild animals were constant dangers. Life was short, mortality was high, and yet early humans managed to assert themselves and spread. This resilience is perhaps the greatest legacy of the Stone Age. It shows that man learned to act creatively, inventively, and collaboratively, not despite, but precisely because of the harsh conditions. Archaeological finds have given us a deep insight into this era. Tools made of stone, bone, and wood, remains of fireplaces, remains of settlements, and works of art paint a picture of a time that may seem far away, but in many ways laid the foundation for our world today. Each new excavation expands our knowledge of how people lived, what they ate, how they hunted, lived, and communicated with each other. If you look at the significance of the Stone Age in a larger context, it becomes clear that it is not only a historical epoch, but a mirror for the fundamental characteristics of man. The urge to solve problems with tools, the ability to preserve and pass on knowledge, curiosity about nature, and the need for cultural expression, all of this is deeply rooted in our nature because it originated in the Stone Age. The Stone Age is therefore not only a chapter of the past, but a key to understanding man in general. She explains why we are the way we are, why we build, think, communicate, and organize. It shows that humanity was a being that always strived for improvement, even if it was initially only a matter of striking a sharper blade or lighting a fire. Seen in this way, the Stone Age is not over, but continues to have an effect on us. Many of our behaviors, instincts, and cultural patterns have their roots in this era. Even though we live in high-rise buildings today, work with computers, and pilot airplanes, we still carry the imprint of that time in which man learned to master his environment with the simplest of means. The history of the Stone Age is therefore not only a history of the past, but also a mirror of our present and a foundation of our future. Chapter 2. The Transition from Animals to Humans, Evolution and Early Forms. The history of the Stone Age does not simply begin in one fell swoop, but is embedded in a long process of evolution that allowed humans to emerge from the line of animals. This transition from animal to human was neither straightforward nor easy, but a complex web of biological, ecological, and cultural changes that spanned millions of years. To understand the Stone Age, one must look at this origin, because it is only from it that the peculiarity of man emerges, who developed tools, language, art, and finally culture. The roots of humanity lie in Africa, where the first pre-humans split off from the common ancestors of chimpanzees and humans about 7 million years ago. These early hominids, which included species such as Sahelanthropus, Ororin, and Ardipithecus, were still closely related to apes, but already showed features that pointed towards humans. Particularly important was the upright gait, which gradually developed. It was a decisive step because it not only allowed greater mobility in open landscapes, but also the use of the hands for purposes other than locomotion. With the upright gait, the anatomy changed fundamentally. The pelvis, spine, and legs adapted, while the hands became freer. This freedom of hands formed the basis for the production and use of tools that were to have a decisive impact on the lives of early humans. The skull also began to change. The brain slowly became larger, the parts of the face flatter, the teeth smaller. However, these changes did not happen abruptly, but over many generations, in a constant interplay between environmental adaptation and cultural development. The genus Homo, to which modern humans belong, originated about 2.5 million years ago. Homo habilis, whose name means skillful man, is considered one of the first representatives. It was he who probably made the first stone tools, and thus marked the beginning of the Stone Age. These tools were still simple, mostly sharply beaten stones that were used for cutting, scraping, or smashing. But they opened up a completely new dimension. For the first time, humans actively intervened in their environment in order to shape and use it. Homo habilis was followed by Homo erectus, the upright walking man. It lived about 1.8 million years ago and is considered one of the most successful human species. Homo erectus spread far beyond Africa to Asia and Europe. With him, a phase of intensive adaptation began, in which not only the tools were refined, but also the use of fire was added. Homo erectus was a skillful hunter, was able to kill larger animals and assert himself in a wide variety of habitats. He was also the first man to colonize the Earth on a large scale, laying the foundation for the worldwide spread of humans. However, evolution was not a linear process. Several human species existed at the same time, transcending each other and influencing each other. In Europe, early representatives of Homo erectus evolved into Neanderthals, Homo neanderthalensis, which is best known for its adaptation to Ice Age conditions. The Neanderthal man had a robust physique that protected him from the cold and was a skilled tool maker and hunter. For a long time, it was considered a primitive sideline, but modern research shows that it was culturally and intellectually highly developed and even developed its own forms of art and symbolism. The roots of humanity lie in Africa, where the first pre-humans split off from the common ancestors. About 200,000 years ago, Homo sapiens, the wise man, our direct ancestor, emerged in Africa. It developed all over the world. Homo sapiens brought a new dimension to human history. It developed complex language, abstract thinking, and art. It marked the beginning of the phase in which humans not only survived, but also developed cultural forms of expression that still shape our self-image today. So the transition from animal to human was not a clear cut, but a slow change. It manifests itself in a combination of biological and cultural factors. Biologically, the brain enlarged, which enabled higher cognitive performance. In terms of cultural history, tools, language, and community life were added. These two strands reinforced each other. The ability to make tools increased the chances of survival, which in turn promoted the transmission of knowledge. Language made it easier to organize in groups, which improved hunting and defense. Art and symbolism created a cohesion that made the group stronger. It is particularly noteworthy that the development of man did not take place in isolation, but always in the context of his environment. Climate change played a major role. Again, early humans had to adapt to new conditions. Cold periods, dry seasons, changed vegetation. This adaptability became the key to their evolution. While other species became extinct, humans survived because they learned to be flexible and actively shape their environment. Nutrition also played a role. The transition from a purely plant-based diet to a mixed diet with meat led to new challenges. Meat provided important proteins that promoted brain growth, but it also required new tools and hunting strategies. This combination of biological, technological, and social factors made the difference between humans and their animal ancestors. The early forms of humans thus show an exciting diversity. From Homo habilis and Homo erectus to Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, an arc spans the development from the first tool to the complex culture. If you look at the transition from animal to man, it becomes clear that man did not come into being suddenly, but is the result of a long history. It is a product of evolution, shaped by millions of years of adaptation, trial and error, success and failure. This story makes it clear that being human is not a matter of course, but the result of a unique interplay of nature and culture. In this sense, the Stone Age is not only an epoch, but also a symbol of this transition. It marks the threshold at which man began to surpass himself, to shape his environment, and to create culture. From the first blows on a stone to the large cave paintings, an arc spanned that man a cultural being. Chapter 3. Paleolithic. Life as a hunter-gatherer. The Paleolithic age is the longest period in human history. It began more than 2 million years ago with the first tools and ended around 10,000 BC when people settled down and farmed in different regions of the world. In this immeasurably long time, people lived exclusively as hunters and gatherers. Their everyday life was characterized by constant movement, the search for food, and the attempt to survive in an often inhospitable world. Everything that distinguishes man, his social organization, his culture, his adaptability, has its origins in this epoch. Life in the Paleolithic was a life in small groups. Families and relatives formed gangs of perhaps 20 to 50 members. These groups were the basis for survival because no human would have been able to overcome the challenges of the wilderness alone. Within the groups, there was a division of labor that was not rigid but flexible. Men often went hunting, women collected berries, roots, nuts, and medicinal plants. But in practice, tasks could vary depending on the situation and ability. This early form of cooperation was crucial to securing food and warding off dangers. Hunting was a central activity, But it was not commonplace, but risky and arduous. In the beginning, people hunted smaller animals which they could kill with simple stone spears or striking tools. Over time, they developed more sophisticated techniques. They chased animals into traps or drove them together into narrow valleys, where they were easier to kill. Later, they also used bows and arrows. Killing large animals such as mammoths or bison was dangerous but worthwhile because they provided a lot of meat, fur, and bones. Such hunts require precise cooperation and presumably also some form of language or at least complex communication. In addition to hunting, collecting was at least as important. Berries, fruits, nuts, roots, and mushrooms made up a large part of the diet. Women knew the plant world very well and knew which plants were edible, which were poisonous, and which were healing. This knowledge was crucial for survival and formed the basis of early natural medicine. Collecting eggs, honey, or small animals also contributed to the diet. In coastal regions, mussels and fish play a major role. In river landscapes, birds and aquatic plants. The variety of food was great, but it always depended on the season and the regional conditions. The mobility of the hunter-gatherer groups was high. They moved from place to place, following the herds, the seasons, and the available resources. They did not build permanent houses, but lived in simple dwellings made of branches, skins, or caves. This flexibility was necessary to survive in an ever-changing environment. Especially during the Ice Ages, people had to undertake long migrations to open up new habitats. This mobility led to the spread of humans from Africa to all continents. The tools of the Paleolithic age were initially simple chisels, but later a great variety developed. Hand axes, scrapers, blades, and spearheads made of stone made it possible to cut up animals, work on hides, shape wood, and process plants. Bones and antlers also served as material for tools, needles, and jewelry. The production of these tools required skill and experience. Knowledge was passed down from generation to generation, and the tools were refined over the millennia. Archaeological finds show that there were regional differences, which indicates cultural traditions. Another decisive advance in the Paleolithic age was the use of fire. Initially, fire may have been used randomly when it was caused by lightning or forest fires. Later, people learned to preserve it and finally to ignite it themselves. Fire provided warmth, light, protection from wild animals, and the ability to cook food. Cooked meat and plants were easier to digest and provided more energy, which promoted the growth of the human brain. Fire also became a social hub. People gathered around it, told stories, made plans, and strengthened their sense of community. The art of the Paleolithic age is one of the most fascinating testimonies of this era. Cave paintings such as those of Lascaux in France or Altamira in Spain show animals in astonishing detail. They are more than mere illustrations. They probably had a ritual or symbolic meaning. Perhaps they were supposed to bring hunting luck, perhaps they represented mythical ideas. In addition to paintings, he created small figures such as the famous Venus of Willendorf, which could symbolize fertility. These works of art prove that people already had an awareness of beauty, symbolism, and transcendence in the Paleolithic age. Religion and faith also played a role. Although there is no direct evidence, circumstantial evidence indicates that people believed in higher powers or spirits even then. Burials with grave goods suggest that people thought of life after death. Rituals, dances, or songs could have been part of community life. These early forms of religion probably strengthened the cohesion of the group and made people feel part of a larger order. Everyday life in the Paleolithic age was hard. Illnesses, injuries, and malnutrition were common. Life expectancy was low, perhaps 30 years on average, even if some people did get older. Nevertheless, the groups managed to assert themselves, raise children, and pass on knowledge. During this time, humans developed the skills that would later make them the dominant species on Earth: cooperation, communication, technology, and culture. The Paleolithic age is therefore not only the earliest epoch, but also the most formative. It shaped the foundations of humanity that can still be felt today. Our need for community, our ability to speak, our inclination towards art and symbolism, all of this has its roots in this period. Even though we live in a completely different world today, we are still hunter-gatherers at heart, whose thoughts and feelings are shaped by the long history of the Paleolithic age. Chapter 4. Stone Tools, Techniques, Advances, and Innovations. It is no coincidence that the name Stone Age is derived from the tools that were of central importance in this era. The handling of stone, the ability to make a useful tool from a raw material, marks a decisive turning point in the development of mankind. Tools are more than mere objects. They are an expression of intelligence, foresight, and cultural transmission of knowledge. They make it possible not only to passively accept the environment, but to actively shape it. In the long history of the Stone Age, tools evolved from simple chisels to highly specialized instruments that already exhibited an astonishing degree of sophistication. The first known tools are attributed to the Oldowan culture and are over 2.5 million years old. These are simple scree tools in which one stone has been knocked off with another to create a sharp edge. This edge could be used to separate pieces of meat from the bone, to chop plants, or to process hides. These tools were not yet beautifully shaped, but they marked the beginning of a tradition that distinguished humans from all other animals: the conscious production and use of tools. From these early experiments, the Acheulean culture developed, which emerged about 1.6 million years ago and is closely associated with Homo erectus. Their characteristic tool was the hand axe, a double-sided device in an almond-shaped shape that could be used for a variety of tasks. The hand axe is a symbol of the inventive spirit of the Stone Age because it already shows a high degree of planning. The shape was not accidental, but was deliberately made to fulfill certain functions. The production required skill and experience, and it can be assumed that this knowledge was passed on within the groups. In addition to hand axes, scrapers, blades, drills, and tips were developed, each intended for specific tasks. Scrapers were used to clean and work on animal skins, drills to pierce bones or wood, tips as a weapon in hunting. Over time, real tool sets were created that were tailored to the needs of everyday life. This specialization shows that people did not just improvise, but developed an understanding of different materials and applications. A major advance was the discovery that certain types of rock could be worked particularly well. Flint, for example, was a preferred material because of its hardness and sharp fracture edges. In regions where flint was not available, people used obsidian, quartzite, or other hard stones. The choice of material depended on the local conditions, but everywhere people showed an astonishing creativity in dealing with the available resources. The technique of tool making developed over time. While initially only coarse blows were used, finer processing methods were later added, in which small splinters were deliberately knocked off to refine the shape. This technique, known as the Levelius method, was particularly used by the Neanderthals. It shows a high degree of planning, as the stone was first prepared and then brought into the desired shape with a well-aimed blow. Such techniques required not only manual dexterity, but also abstract thinking, which included the ability to think ahead of work steps. The innovations were not limited to stone. Bones, antlers, and wood were also processed into tools. Bones were particularly suitable for needles, harpoons, or points. Antlers for hoes and hammers. Wood for spears and clubs. This variety of materials shows that people had developed a deep understanding of the properties of nature. They knew which material was best suited for which purpose and used it accordingly. Particularly noteworthy is the development of composite tools. A stone alone could achieve a lot, but in combination with wood and plant fibers, completely new possibilities emerged. Stone blades were inserted into wooden shafts and fastened with resin or leather strips to create spears, axes, or knives. This innovation was a milestone because it required not only technical skill, but also the ability to combine different materials and create stable connections. The tools of the Stone Age were not only functional, but also had a cultural dimension. Some hand axes and blades were shaped particularly carefully and symmetrically, far beyond what would have been practically necessary. This suggests that they also had aesthetic or symbolic meaning. Perhaps they served as status symbols or as gifts in ritual acts. Such finds show that tools were not only tools, but also an expression of a growing world of symbols. Passing on the knowledge of tool-making was a decisive factor. It can be assumed that the techniques were passed down from generation to generation, possibly through imitation, perhaps also through an early form of language. The ability to preserve and pass on knowledge is a characteristic that fundamentally distinguishes humans from other animals. Tools thus became a medium of tradition and cultural development. The innovations in tool manufacturing eventually led to specialization within the groups. Some people were particularly skilled and made tools for others, while they might take on other tasks. This promoted the division of labor and strengthened social cohesion. Tools also became a commodity. As early as the Stone Age, traces of exchange in which flint was transported over long distances can be traced. To sum up, the tools of the Stone Age were not just practical tools, but formed the foundation of human culture. They made it possible to hunt animals, process plants, make clothes, build houses, and create works of art. They were an expression of intelligence, creativity, and social organization. With every blow to a stone, with every newly developed technology, man took a step further on the way to civilization. The history of stone tools is thus, at the same time, the history of the incarnation. Chapter 5. Fire, Mastery and Cultural Significance. Hardly any invention or discovery in human history has been as momentous as the mastery of fire. On the one hand, fire is a natural phenomenon that has existed since the beginning of the earth. And on the other hand, in the hands of early humans, it became a tool that fundamentally changed their lives. The path from the chance encounter with a burning tree after a lightning strike to the deliberate ignition and use of fire was long and crucial. Without fire, man would not have been able to survive, spread, and evolve in the way that eventually did. The first people encountered fire in nature. Lightning bolts, volcanic eruptions, or forest fires created situations in which they could observe the burning element. At first, it may have been just an object of fear, something that was dangerous and destructive. But at some point, people realized the benefits that fire could have. They learned to preserve it by transporting embers in bark or ashes and keeping them alive for a long time. This was the first step, even before they mastered the technique of kindling. When people learn to consciously light the fire is still difficult to determine today. Finds from various regions indicate that Homo erectus was already regularly using fire about 1 million years ago. Secured fireplaces, which were intentionally created, date from this time. However, it probably took many millennia before the deliberate ignition of fire by sparks or friction became an everyday skill. This ability was a cultural breakthrough of great significance. The importance of fire for daily life was immense. It provided warmth on cold nights and in the icy climate conditions of the Ice Ages. Without fire, it would hardly have been possible to survive in the northern regions of Europe and Asia. The fire also protected against wild animals that avoided the light and heat. It offered security and extended the day, because with the light of the fire you could still work, talk, or perform rituals after sunset. A crucial benefit of fire was the ability to cook food. Meat and plants that were difficult to digest raw or even poisonous could be made digestible by heating. Cooked food provides more energy with less effort for digestion, which in turn promotes brain growth. Some researchers suspect that the development of the human brain is closely linked to the use of fire and cooked food. In addition, supplies could be made more durable, which increased food security. However, fire was not only a practical tool, but also a cultural symbol. It stood for life, warmth, and community, but also for danger and destruction. Many cultures of the Stone Age probably developed myths and rituals around fire. Archaeological finds of fireplaces in caves indicate that fire was not only used for cooking, but also for social and ritual purposes. The circle around the fire was a place of encounter, exchange, and perhaps also of storytelling. Stories, songs, and rituals could have their origin here. The control of fire also changed people's mobility. They were able to open up new habitats because they were now able to defy cold and darkness. Fire made it possible to thin dense forests to create hunting grounds, and it helped to make tools by making stones or wood more workable. Later, it also played a role in the processing of metals, but already in the Stone Age it was a universal tool that opened up numerous new possibilities. The techniques for lighting fires developed over the millennia. Friction of two woods, the beating of flint against pyrite, the use of tinder, all these are methods that were probably already known in the Stone Age. Lighting fires required patience and skill and was an art that was passed down from generation to generation. Anyone who knew how to light the fire in a group probably enjoyed a high reputation. The fire was also of great symbolic importance. It became a symbol of control over nature. Man was no longer just a passive part of his environment, but began to actively shape it. Fire was a testament to his ability to harness the forces of nature and transform them into culture. It was also a symbol of power that was respected and feared. The ambivalence of fire, useful and dangerous at the same time, shaped how people dealt with this element. Traces of burned bones, ashes, and charred wood give us an impression today of how much the fire changed people's lives. In caves such as Zhokudayan in China or Geshe Benot Yaakov in Israel, early fireplaces have been discovered that testify to conscious use. They prove that fire was not just an occasional phenomenon, but an integral part of everyday life. If one summarizes the importance of fire in the Stone Age, it becomes clear that it was more than a tool. It was a bearer of culture, a center of social life, and an engine of evolution. The history of man as a designer of his environment began with fire. It marks the step from mere adaptation to nature to the active shaping of it. Without fire, humanity would not have become what it is today. Fire is therefore one of the most powerful symbols of the Stone Age and the Incarnation. It stands for the moment when man began not only to endure the forces of nature, but to use them. It stands for the ability to preserve and pass on knowledge, for cohesion in the group, and for the courage to dare to try new things. In this sense, fire is not just an invention, but a milestone that determined the direction of all human history. Chapter 6. Hunting Strategies and Foraging in the Stone Age. Life in the Stone Age was characterized by the constant struggle for survival. Food was not available as a matter of course. It had to be searched for, collected, and hunted day after day. Hunting and gathering formed the two cornerstones of nutrition and determined people's everyday lives for many millennia. Man was not the strongest or fastest hunter in the animal kingdom, but he developed intelligence, cooperation, and inventiveness to get prey. Equally important was the deep knowledge of plants, seasons, and landscapes, which made it possible to use nature for one's own food. Hunting was a risky but rewarding activity. Large animals such as mammoths, bison, or aurochs provided not only meat but also skins for clothing, bones for tools, and tendons for strings. To kill such powerful animals, brute force was not enough. People developed sophisticated hunting strategies based on planning and cooperation. One possibility was to chase the animals over longer distances. Humans were able to walk for longer periods of time without overheating thanks to their upright gait and their ability to sweat. In this way, they managed to tire animals until they were easier to kill. Another strategy was to drive animals into traps or natural obstacles. Archaeological finds suggest that humans drove entire herds into narrow valleys, swamps, or over cliffs, where they could be killed more easily. Such hunts require close coordination within the group. Everyone had to know their role, whether as a driver, shooter, or trapper. These forms of hunting strengthened social cohesion and promoted the development of language and communication. In addition to hunting large animals, the killing of smaller prey also played an important role.
Hares, birds, fish, or reptiles could be caught with simpler means and offered a more reliable source of food. Traps, nets, or fish hooks made of bone and plant fibers were used. Especially in river and coastal regions, fishing was an important supplement to hunting. The variety of methods shows the adaptability of people to the respective habitats. Just as important as hunting was collecting. Plants probably made up the largest part of the diet, even if they seem less spectacular than hunting. Women knew the landscapes very well and knew when and where berries were ripe, which roots were edible, and which were poisonous. They collected nuts, seeds, fruits, and herbs, which were not only food but also remedies. This knowledge of nature was essential for survival and was passed on from generation to generation. The combination of hunting and gathering ensured a balanced diet. Meat provided proteins and fats, plants, vitamins, and minerals. This diversity strengthened resistance to disease and helped people adapt to different environments. However, the availability of food was always uncertain. In good times there was abundance, in bad times, hunger. This uncertainty shaped life in the Stone Age and made flexibility a survival strategy. Eating together was a central part of social life. Food was usually shared, as this strengthened the cohesion of the group. Those who hunted successfully gained reputation, but the proceeds were shared with the others to ensure the survival of all. This sharing of food is considered one of the foundations of human societies. It shows that humans were not only focused on individual survival, but thought in communities from the very beginning. Fire also played a role in hunting and nutrition. Meat was fried or boiled, plants were cooked, making them easier to digest. By smoking or drying, meat could be preserved longer, which was particularly advantageous in cold regions. These techniques opened up new ways to store food and stock up for bad times. Hunting also had a spiritual and symbolic dimension. Many cave paintings show animals that were hunted, often in impressive detail. These depictions could have been an expression of hunting magic, the idea that depicting the animal increases the chances of a successful hunt. Rituals before or after the hunt may have served to appease the spirits of the animals or to strengthen the community. Hunting was therefore not only a practical process, but also a cultural event that was deeply rooted in beliefs. The hunting strategies and collecting practices of the Stone Age people show a deep connection with nature. They knew the migration routes of the animals, the growth times of the plants, the signs of changes in the weather. This knowledge was essential for survival and was preserved in myths, stories, and rituals. Humans were not rulers of nature, but part of a network in which they learned to fit in and use resources sustainably. However, one must not overlook the harshness of life. Failures in hunting could mean hunger. Diseases due to malnutrition were common. In times of cold, drought, or natural disasters, entire groups had to look for new habitats, which was associated with danger. Nevertheless, the history of the Stone Age shows that through inventiveness, cooperation, and perseverance, people were able to survive even in adverse conditions. In summary, hunting and foraging formed the backbone of life in the Stone Age. They were more than mere survival strategies. They were expressions of human intelligence, creativity, and community. In hunting, people learned to work together, develop tools, and understand their environment. In collecting, they retained a deep knowledge of plants and nature. Both together made them a species that not only survived, but laid the foundation for their later cultural and civilizational development.
Chapter 7, Art in the Stone Age, Cave Paintings, Figures, and Symbols. The art of the Stone Age is one of the most fascinating testimonies of early human history. It opens a window into the world of thought of our ancestors, into their ideas of nature, community, and spirituality. If we look at the paintings of Lascaux or Altamira today, at small figures such as the Venus of Willendorf or engraved symbols in bones and stones, we can see that the people of the Stone Age were not only survivors, but also creators who brought beauty and meaning into their world. These works of art are evidence of abstract thinking, of the desire for expression, and perhaps also of a first form of religion. The most famous testimonies of Stone Age are the cave paintings. In France, Spain, and other parts of Europe, representations that are up to 30,000 years old have been preserved. They show animals such as horses, bison, mammoths, or reindeer in astonishing detail and dynamics. Some animals are depicted realistically, others are stylized, and often the paintings seem to capture movement. These works of art were created deep in the caves, in places that were not easily accessible. This suggests that they were more than mere decoration, but probably part of rituals or spiritual acts. The question of the meaning of these paintings still occupies scientists today. One theory says that it was hunting magic, i.e., the attempt to influence the hunt through the symbolic representation. Others see it as an expression of myths or spiritual ideas, perhaps even early forms of shamanism. Still others suggest that the caves were a kind of sacred space where the community connected with the supernatural. Regardless of the exact meaning, it is clear that art played a central role in people's lives. In addition to the paintings, there are engravings and carvings in stones, bones, and antlers. Lines, spirals, and geometric patterns show that people not only wanted to depict the visible world, but also created abstract forms. These signs could have been the first symbols, perhaps even precursors of writing or calendars. They point to abstract thinking that went beyond immediate survival. The small figures, the so-called Venus statuettes, deserve special attention. These figures, usually made of stone, bone, or ivory, represent women with strongly emphasized sexual characteristics, large breasts, wide hips, pronounced bellies. Their faces often only hinted at or completely absent. The interpretation of these figures is controversial. Many researchers see them as fertility symbols, perhaps representations of a primordial mother or goddess who gives life. Others suspect that they were amulets that were supposed to bring good luck and fertility. Whatever their exact meaning, they prove that the people of the Stone Age expressed ideas of femininity, birth, and life in symbolic form. The art of the Stone Age was not limited to pictures and figures. Music probably also played a role. Finds of flutes made of bones, for example from the Swabian Alb in Germany, show that people were already making music over 30,000 years ago. These instruments with carefully drilled holes demonstrate craftsmanship and a keen ear for sounds. Music could have been part of rituals, but it could also have sprung from the joy of sound. It created community and strengthened cohesion. Body art was probably also widespread. Finds of ochre pigments indicate that people painted not only cave walls, but also their bodies. Paintings, tattoos, or jewelry made of shells, teeth, and bones were expressions of identity, status, or belonging. These forms of art turned the body itself into a canvas and helped to make social differences or special roles within the group visible. The emergence of art is a decisive step in human history. It shows that people were not only fixated on survival, but had a need for expression, symbolism, and transcendence. Art created a space in which the world was interpreted, ordered, and given meaning. It was a means of sharing experiences, telling stories, and preserving knowledge. It was also an expression of creativity that went far beyond the useful. It is interesting that the art of the Stone Age was found all over the world, not only in Europe. In Australia, Africa, and Asia, there are also paintings and engravings, some of which are even older. This shows that the inclination towards art is universally anchored in human beings. It does not belong to a particular culture, but is a part of human nature. The creation of art is closely linked to the development of language and thought. To paint an animal or carve a figure, you need not only manual dexterity, but also the ability to design something in your mind and symbolically represent it. This ability to abstract is a basis for everything that was later to become writing, religion, or science. Art was thus not only an expression, but also an engine of intellectual development. In conclusion, the art of the Stone Age is a key to understanding this era.
It shows that humans were not only survivors, but already had a rich inner life. Cave paintings, figures, symbols, music, and body art are testimonies to a culture that created beauty, meaning, and community. They are an expression of a deep humanity that still touches us today. When we see the pictures of horses, bison, or people painted tens of thousands of years ago, we recognize not only the world of the Stone Age, but also a part of ourselves.
Chapter 8. Religion, Magic, and Worldviews of Early Humans. If you look at the history of mankind, the emergence of religion and worldviews is one of the most profound developments. As early as the Stone Age, we find traces that indicate that early humans not only lived in the visible world, but also developed ideas of invisible powers, spirits, and supernatural forces. These early forms of religion and magic gave people orientation, strengthened the community, and offered explanations for phenomena that they could not explain otherwise. In a world full of dangers, uncertainties, and inexplicable events, faith was a means of interpreting reality and dealing with it. The earliest references to religious ideas come from burials. Tens of thousands of years ago, people were not simply left behind, but carefully buried. In some graves, there were burial goods such as tools, jewelry, or food. This suggests that people believed in life after death, or at least had the idea that the deceased continued to exist in some form. Death was therefore not the end, but a transition into another form of existence. This idea is a crucial feature of religious thought. Magic probably played an equally important role. It was an attempt to influence the invisible forces of the world. Rituals, dances, or songs before the hunt could have served to ensure hunting luck. Cave paintings of animals may not have been created just as art, but as a magical act to gain power over the animals depicted. Figures such as the Venus statuettes may also have had magical significance by symbolizing fertility and life. Magic was thus a practical tool to reduce uncertainty and give hope for success. The worldviews of early humans were closely linked to nature. The sun, moon, stars, animals, and plants were not only seen as resources, but as carriers of forces. Perhaps people believed that animals had souls or spirits of their own. The hunt was then not only a physical act, but also a spiritual encounter that was accompanied by respect and rituals. In many contemporary cultures that still retain traditional hunter-gatherer structures, we find similar ideas, suggesting that this way of thinking is very old. Shamanism probably played an equally important role. Shamans were people within the group who had a special connection to the spirit world. They could enter another level of consciousness through trance, dance, or the use of plants and communicate with spirits or ancestors. This ability made them important figures who offered healing, advice, and protection. It is not possible to say with certainty whether shamans already existed in this form in the Stone Age, but many finds, such as masks, painted skeletons, or depictions of half-human, half-animal figures, point to such a role. Sky observation could also have played a role. The course of the sun and moon, the cycles of the seasons, the changes in the sky, all this had a direct impact on people's lives. They determined when animals migrated, when plants grew, and when the cold came. It is conceivable that early humans not only observed the sky practically, but also interpreted it mythically. Stars could have been seen as ancestors or gods, the moon as a sign of life and renewal. Religion and magic were not separate areas in the Stone Age, but part of everyday life. They gave answers to questions that could not be solved by the means of experience. Why do people die? Why is winter coming? Why does one hunt succeed while another fails? These questions were answered by myths, rituals, and symbols. This gave people a sense of control and order in an uncertain world. The social functions of religion and magic should not be underestimated. Rituals strengthened the cohesion of the group. They gave a sense of belonging and created a common identity. A hunting ritual performed by all members was not only a magical act, but also a social event that strengthened the community.
Burials with ritual elements gave comfort to the bereaved and helped them to come to terms with the loss. Religion was thus not only an explanation of the world, but also a means of organizing social life. Archaeological finds give us only fragments of this spiritual life, but they give us an idea of how important religion and magic were. Stalagmites can be found in caves that were deliberately erected or worked, perhaps as altars. Figures with hybrid creatures, half animal, half human, could represent mythical figures. Rock carvings of hands, lines, or symbols could have been ritual signs. These traces show that people not only acted practically, but also thought in symbolic categories. Over time, worldviews changed. In the Neolithic age, with the introduction of agriculture and sedentary life, new ideas played a role. The fertility of soil, plants, and animals became more of a focus. Rituals that were previously focused on hunting and animals could now have a greater impact on harvests and weather. But the roots of these religions were already in the Old and Mesolithic age, when people began not only to experience the world, but to interpret it. In summary, religion, magic, and worldviews were not secondary aspects in the Stone Age, but central components of life. They helped to understand the world, provided security in uncertain times, and strengthened the community. They were an expression of a way of thinking that went beyond mere survival and led man into a spiritual dimension. The traces that we still find today in the form of graves, paintings, and figures are testimonies to this thinking. They make it clear that humans were not only biological, but also spiritual beings from an early age.
Chapter 9. Community and Social Structures in Hunter-Gatherer Groups. Life in the Stone Age was characterized not only by tools, hunting, and foraging, but also by the social structures that enabled people to survive. Humans are by nature a community being, and even in the early hunter-gatherer groups, it became clear that cooperation, solidarity, and social ties were essential for survival. These early communities laid the groundwork for everything that would later produce more complex societies, states, and civilizations. The groups of the Stone Age probably consisted of 20 to 50 people, sometimes a little more, depending on the region and resources. This scale was ideal, small enough to stay mobile, but large enough to hunt, gather, and defend together. Within the groups, families formed the core, but the community was defined not only by consanguinity, but also by social ties formed by marriage, friendship, and mutual obligations. The division of labor was flexible, but not accidental. Men often took over the hunt because they were physically stronger and could accept the risk of injury during the hunt. Women collected plants, took care of children, and contributed to everyday food. But these roles were not rigid. There is evidence that females also participated in hunting, especially for smaller animals, and that males also gathered. This flexibility was necessary to ensure the survival of the group. Children grew into the tasks at an early age, learned through observation and imitation, and were gradually integrated into the community. Sharing food was a central principle. Hunting successes were not only used by the hunter himself, but shared with the group. This sharing created trust and strengthened cohesion. It ensured that even in times when an individual was unsuccessful, the community as a whole could survive. This principle of solidarity was the basis for social justice and made survival possible in an uncertain world. Conflicts were inevitable in the groups, but there were mechanisms to resolve them. Older members often had a special authority through their experience and acted as advisors. Decisions were probably made by consensus, as authoritarian structures would have been difficult to enforce in small groups. Disputes could be resolved through conversations, rituals, or the distribution of resources. Violence within the group was not ruled out, but cohesion was so important that mechanisms were developed to avoid escalation. The role of the elders was also significant because they preserved the knowledge of the community. In a world without writing, it was crucial that knowledge was passed on orally. Older people knew hunting strategies, medicinal plants, stories, and myths. They were living archives whose experience was essential for the survival of the group.
This appreciation of knowledge meant that even people who could no longer actively hunt or gather retained their place in the community. Social ties beyond one's own group were also important. Meetings with neighboring groups allowed for the exchange of partners, which prevented inbreeding and encouraged the trade in rare materials such as flint or shells. These contacts strengthened networks and expanded the possibilities of the community. Even in the Stone Age, there was a form of super-regional exchange that formed the basis of later trade networks. Symbols and rituals played an important role in social life. Cave paintings, jewelry, and body paintings could have not only religious but also social functions. They made belonging visible, strengthened identity, and marked transitions such as birth, growing up, or death. Rituals and festivals were opportunities to celebrate cohesion and confirm the social order. Music, dance, and song were probably part of such events and promoted the feeling of being part of a larger unit. The social structures of the hunter-gatherer groups were thus surprisingly complex. They were based on cooperation, solidarity, and communication. From the very beginning, man was a being that could only survive in community. These communities were flexible enough to adapt to different environments and stable enough to pass on knowledge and traditions across generations. It is remarkable that many of these structures continue to have an impact in modern societies today. Sharing, the division of labor, the importance of rituals and symbols, respect for knowledge, and the need to resolve conflicts are all principles that originated in the Stone Age and form the core of human societies. Life in hunter-gatherer groups was hard and full of deprivation, but it was also characterized by a deep sense of community. Everyone knew that their survival depended on cohesion with others. This interdependence shaped man into a social being who takes responsibility not only for himself, but also for others. In summary, the communities of the Stone Age were not primitive heaps, but social systems with clear structures, rules, and values. They were small but highly organized, flexible but nevertheless consistent. They created a social network that gave people security, identity, and meaning. Without these early communities, the development of humanity would not have been possible because they formed the foundation for everything that later gave rise to more complex societies.
Chapter 10. The Mesolithic, Transition and Change. The Mesolithic age, also known as the Mesolithic, is an epoch that is often overshadowed by the Old and Neolithic ages. It is sometimes seen as a transitional period, but it is precisely this transitional nature that makes it so significant. It marks the change from a world in which people lived exclusively as hunter-gatherers to a world in which they settled down, farmed, and domesticated animals. Between about 10,000 and 6,000 BC, which differed depending on the region, profound changes took place that laid the foundation for the later development of civilization. At the end of the Paleolithic age, the last great ice age had come to an end. The climate became warmer, glaciers retreated, forests expanded, and with them the animal world also changed. The large Ice Age animals such as mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, or giant deer disappeared, and in their place came smaller species such as deer, wild boar, or deer. These changes forced people to adapt their way of life. Big game hunts became less important, and hunting smaller, more nimble animals required new techniques and weapons. During this time, the bow with arrows developed into one of the most important weapons. It allowed for more precise and flexible hunting and made it possible to effectively kill smaller animals. Flint arrowheads, often carefully ground and inserted into wooden shafts, show the high level of skill people have in using their tools. Fishing hooks, nets, and harpoons have also been improved, reflecting the importance of fishing and the use of water resources. Rivers, lakes, and coasts became important sources of food, and shellfish mounds found in some regions attest to the intensive use of marine resources. In addition to hunting, plants gained in importance.
Although humans did not yet make a living from agriculture, they deliberately collected edible plants and presumably already began to consciously care for individual species. Wild grains were collected and possibly processed in early forms. Finds of millstones from this period indicate that seeds were ground and processed into mush. These developments are harbingers of later agriculture, which became the dominant way of life in the Neolithic age. The way of life of the people in the Mesolithic was semi-nomadic. They built temporary settlements on rivers, lakes, or coasts, which were used for a longer period of time before moving on. Archaeological finds of huts, fireplaces, and waste pits show that these settlements were increasingly organized. Some groups regularly returned to the same places, which is a first form of sedentariness. This development was accompanied by a stronger attachment to certain landscapes and resources. The social organization also changed. In smaller, flexible groups of the Paleolithic age, mobility had been the most important feature. In the Mesolithic, the longer stays in one place led to communities becoming larger and more complex. Structures emerged that pointed to a division of labor and specialization. Men and women continued to have different roles, but the variety of food sources and tools created new roles within the group. The trade in special materials such as flint, obsidian, or shells also increased, leading to contacts between more distant communities. The Mesolithic age was also a time of cultural expression. Works of art from this era differ from those of the Paleolithic age. While the large cave paintings declined, smaller engravings, figures, and pieces of jewelry were created. Body decorations, tattoos, and artistically crafted tools probably had a social or symbolic meaning. Funerals with rich grave goods proved that social differences gradually increased. Some members of the community received more attention in death, indicating a growing hierarchy. Religious ideas remained closely linked to nature. Burials, offerings, and rock carvings show that the belief in spirits, ancestors, or natural forces was still present. But a change is emerging. The growing sedentariness and the stronger attachment to certain places have led to sanctuaries, sacrificial sites, or graves becoming more important. The place itself took on a symbolic significance, and this prepared the ground for the later cultures of the Neolithic age with their megalithic sites and places of worship. Another characteristic of the Mesolithic was the increasing diversity of lifestyles. In regions with rich nature, such as Scandinavia or Central Europe, people lived more from hunting and fishing, while in other regions, such as the Middle East, the first steps towards agriculture were already being taken. These differences show that there was no one-size-fits-all path, but that people developed different strategies depending on their environment. The Mesolithic was thus a time of experimentation and transition. The people were no longer pure hunters and gatherers, but they were also not yet full-fledged farmers. They lived in an in-between world in which old and new ways of life coexisted. This flexibility made them resilient and ready for the changes that came with the Neolithic period. In summary, the Mesolithic age was a crucial period, even if it is often overlooked. It was the time when people began to become more sedentary, developed new tools and techniques, diversified their diets, and made social structures more complex. It was the bridge between the world of hunter-gatherers and the world of farmers and cattle breeders. Without the Mesolithic, the Neolithic revolution would hardly have been conceivable, because it was during this time that people laid the foundation for the greatest change in the history of the Stone Age.
Chapter 11. The beginning of sedentary life, agriculture, and domestication. With the beginning of sedentary life, a profound change in the history of mankind began, which is often described as the greatest revolution of the Stone Age. For a long time, humans had lived as hunters and gatherers, adapting to the rhythms of nature, wandering around in small groups and wandering the land to find food. But about 10,000 years ago, this pattern changed fundamentally. People began to cultivate plants in a targeted manner and keep animals permanently. This development, which took place independently in different regions of the world, ushered in the Neolithic and led to humanity creating the foundations of civilization.
Agriculture did not start everywhere at the same time, but in different regions with different plants and animals. The so-called Fertile Crescent is particularly well known in the Middle East, where people began to cultivate wild grains such as emmer and einkorn, as well as legumes such as lentils or peas. At the same time, sheep, goats, and later cattle were domesticated. In China, the cultivation of millet and rice developed. In Central and South America, corn, beans, and pumpkin. While in Africa, millet species and sorghum were specifically cultivated. This diversity shows that sedentary life is not due to a single origin, but was a global process that was shaped by the respective environmental conditions. The reasons for this change are manifold. Climate changes at the end of the Ice Age caused forests to spread and wildlife to become less numerous. The growing population made it necessary to find new ways of procuring food. At the same time, people discovered through observation that plants grow new from seeds and that animals kept near settlements produced offspring that were easier to control. These findings gradually led to people consciously intervening in nature instead of just adapting to it. Sedentary life changed people's lives in all areas. Instead of living in mobile groups, permanent settlements were created. Houses were built from clay, wood, or stone that could be used for generations. Villages were formed in which several families lived together. With the sedentary lifestyle, a new relationship to the environment emerged. Fields had to be cultivated, weeds removed, animals fed and protected. The dependence on a fixed place was greater, but it also allowed for a more stable food supply. Agriculture brought advantages, but also new challenges. On the one hand, people were now able to produce more food, which promoted population growth. Surpluses could be stored and used in bad times. On the other hand, settling down also meant more work. Fields had to be plowed, weeds removed, animals fed and protected. Diseases spread more easily because people lived closer together and were in contact with domesticated animals. Conflicts over land and resources also increased, as attachment to a particular place brought with it new forms of ownership. The domestication of animals was just as revolutionary as agriculture. Sheep and goats provided not only meat but also milk and wool. Cattle were used as draft animals and helped to plow the fields. Dogs that had already been domesticated from wolves in the past served as hunting helpers, guard animals, and companions. The close relationship between humans and animals changed daily life and created new dependencies. Animals became partners, but also resources, the care and use of which shaped social and economic life. With the sedentary lifestyle, the social structure also changed. In hunter-gatherer groups, society was organized in a rather egalitarian way, as property was difficult to transport and food was usually shared. In the sedentary communities, on the other hand, the possibility of hoarding surpluses arose for the first time. Those who owned more land or cattle could gain an advantage. As a result, social differences and hierarchies developed. Some families or individuals gained influence and power by having resources. This was the beginning of structures that later led to domination and statehood in more complex societies. Agriculture also had a cultural impact. People developed new tools such as plows, sickles, or millstones, which were specially designed for working fields and grain. Ceramics played an increasingly important role, as they were ideal for storing supplies. Pots, bowls, and jugs were made and decorated, which combined functional and artistic aspects at the same time. Sedentary lifestyle led to more objects being produced and owned, which greatly expanded material culture. Religion also changed during this time. While animals and hunting were the focus of presentations in the Paleolithic age, fertility, harvest, and natural cycles now came more to the fore. Goddess figures, which symbolized the fertility of the earth, gained in importance. Rituals to secure the harvest or to protect the herds became central. Sacred places were created that were closely linked to agriculture. The cycle of sowing and harvesting shaped religious ideas as well as the life of the community. Sedentary life also created the prerequisites for technical and social innovations that reached far beyond the Stone Age. With the surplus of food, people could specialize in other activities, such as crafts or trade. This led to differentiation within society. The first beginnings of division of labor, trade, and crafts were already recognizable in the Neolithic age. On this basis, cities, states, and advanced civilizations later developed. In summary, the beginning of sedentary life through agriculture and domestication was the decisive turning point in the history of mankind. He transformed man from a nomad who followed nature to a designer of his environment. This step brought enormous opportunities, but also new challenges. It was the beginning of property, inequality, but also of cultural flourishing and social development. Without this change, the history of civilization as we know it would not have been possible. Sedentariness was the key to the emergence of the modern world.
Chapter 12: Neolithic Revolution, Emergence of Agriculture and Livestock Breeding. The so-called Neolithic Revolution is one of the most significant upheavals in the entire history of mankind. It marked the beginning of a new age in which man was no longer just a hunter-gatherer, but became the producer of his own food. This change did not occur abruptly, but in a long process that spanned thousands of years. But the effects were so profound that they laid the foundations of later civilization. Dispersed, mobile groups became sedentary communities. Small villages developed into settlements and eventually cities. And simple tools gave rise to a variety of new technologies adapted to the needs of agriculture and animal husbandry. The causes of the emergence of agriculture and livestock breeding lie in an interplay of environmental changes and human observation. With the end of the last ice age, the world changed drastically. Forests spread, large animal species disappeared or became rarer, while smaller animals and plant species dominated. People who had previously lived in dependence on the migratory movements of large herds had to develop new strategies. At the same time, they realized that plants grew from seeds and that animals that lived near them could be tamed and controlled for generations. From these findings, the idea slowly grew not only to use nature, but to actively shape it. The so-called Fertile Crescent in the Middle East was one of the first regions in which agriculture and animal husbandry were systematically practiced. Here, wild grains such as emmer and inkhorn were domesticated, as well as lentils, chickpeas, and other legumes. At the same time, sheep and goats were kept, and later also cattle and pigs. In East Asia, it was rice, in Central America, corn and pumpkin, in South America, the potato, in Africa, millet and sorghum. All over the world, people found their own way of farming. This parallel development shows that the move to the Neolithic way of life was a universal response to the new conditions after the Ice Age. With agriculture, people's relationship to time and space changed. The seasons became more important because sowing and harvesting had to be planned precisely. The rhythm of nature became the determining rhythm for the life of the community. People learned to stock up on supplies to survive the months between harvests. Dependence on a certain place led to sedentary life, and with it permanent houses, villages, and later also fortified complexes were built. Man now became more attached to the land he was cultivating, and for the first time developed a sense of possession and territoriality. Livestock breeding brought additional advantages. Animals provided not only meat, but also milk, wool, leather, and bones. They served as pack and draft animals, which considerably expanded man's workforce. Oxen could be used to plow fields, and horses or donkeys could be used to transport loads. These new possibilities led to agriculture becoming more productive and able to feed larger communities. At the same time, a closer relationship between humans and animals emerged, which was reflected in religion and culture. Many early deities had animal traits or were associated with herds and fertility. However, the Neolithic Revolution brought not only advantages, but also new problems. The diet became more stable, but also more one-sided.
Diseases were able to spread more evenly in the more densely populated villages, and proximity to animals gave rise to new infectious diseases that were previously unknown. The hard physical work in the fields led to signs of wear and tear and diseases of the musculoskeletal system. Archaeological studies show that the life expectancy of many people initially even fell after the changeover before the advantages of agriculture became established in the long term. With the emergence of surpluses, social structures also changed. In hunter-gatherer societies, property was difficult to preserve because the groups were mobile. In the sedentary communities, on the other hand, supplies could be stored and herds of cattle herded. As a result, some families owned more than others and were able to derive power from this. The first social hierarchies emerged, which are reflected in graves with rich grave goods and in the different sizes of houses. Man now became more attached to the land he was cultivating and for the first time developed a sense of possession and territoriality. Livestock breeding brought additional advantages. Animals provided not only meat, but also milk, wool, leather, and bones. They served as pack and draft animals, which considerably expanded man's workforce. Oxen could be used to plow fields, and horses or donkeys could be used to transport loads. These new possibilities led to agriculture becoming more productive and able to feed larger communities. At the same time, a closer relationship between humans and animals emerged, which was reflected in religion and culture. Many early deities had animal traits or were associated with herds and fertility. In summary, the Neolithic revolution was the decisive step that paved the way to civilization. With it came agriculture, animal husbandry, sedentariness, social hierarchies, and a material culture that went far beyond the bare necessities. Humanity entered a new phase that enabled it to develop cities, states, and advanced civilizations. But this change was ambivalent. It brought prosperity, but also dependency, stability, but also new forms of inequality and disease. In its entirety, however, the Neolithic revolution was the milestone that laid the foundations for the world we live in today.
Chapter 13. Architecture in the Stone Age, Huts, Villages, and Monuments. With the sedentariness of the Neolithic age, a new era of architecture began. While the people of the Paleolithic and Mesolithic age had lived mainly in caves, tents, or simple dwellings made of wood, fur, and bone, permanent settlements with permanent houses, villages, and finally monumental buildings now emerged. Architecture became an expression of the new way of life, which was based on sedentariness, stockpiling, and community. It reflected the close connection to certain places and showed that people were now able to make their environment sustainable, not only with tools, but also through buildings. The earliest permanent dwellings of the Neolithic age were simple huts made of wood, clay, and straw. They were laid out in a rectangular or oval shape with posts supporting the roof and walls plastered with clay to provide protection from wind and weather. Fireplaces inside provided warmth and allowed cooking. These huts were already much more stable than the mobile accommodations of the hunter-gatherers, but they remained relatively simple and functional. Nevertheless, they meant a huge step as they were used permanently and formed the basis for villages. With the emergence of agriculture and animal husbandry, the houses became larger and more complex. In settlements such as Çatalhöyük in present-day Turkey, which existed around 7000 BC, we already see amazingly organized building forms. The houses stood close together and were built of mud bricks. They had flat roofs that also served as paths, as there were no roads in the modern sense. Ladders from above were used to access the interiors, which were divided into several areas. This construction method shows not only technical skill, but also a new understanding of urban life. The people lived in close community and developed rules for living together in a dense settlement. In Central Europe, post houses were built, which were mostly rectangular and based on wooden scaffolding. Particularly well known are the so-called longhouses, which could be up to 30 meters long and offered space for several families. They were built of wood and clay and covered with thatched roofs.
These buildings were more than just residential buildings. They also symbolized the social organization of the community. Several generations were able to live under one roof, which strengthened cohesion and pooled the workforce. In addition to the dwellings, people also developed special buildings for stockpiling. Grain had to be stored in a dry place, and for this purpose, pits, warehouses, or raised platforms were built. These structures were central as they guaranteed food security and allowed for surpluses, which in turn formed the basis for trade and social wealth. The architecture of the Stone Age was thus closely linked to the economic foundations. A particularly impressive chapter of Stone Age architecture are the monumental buildings. As early as the Neolithic, enormous structures made of stone were created that went far beyond the functional. Dolmens, menhirs, and stone circles can be found in many regions of Europe and testify to an amazing collective achievement. In order to move stones weighing tons, planning, organization, and cooperation of many people were necessary. Such monuments probably had religious or cultic significance. Perhaps they served as burial sites, places of worship, or astronomical markers. The most famous example is Stonehenge in England, which was built several thousand years after the first Neolithic settlements and remain a mystery to this day. Tombs are also part of the architecture of the Stone Age. Megalithic tombs, such as those found in Northern and Western Europe, show that people built not only for life, but also for death. These structures were intricately constructed and lasted for thousands of years, indicating that they were not only intended for individuals, but for entire communities or families. They made the belief in a connection between the living and the dead visible and were an expression of an early culture of remembrance. The architecture also had a social dimension. The construction of large structures required the cooperation of many people, which in turn required hierarchies, organization, and leadership. Monumental buildings are therefore also indications of growing social differences and the emergence of elites who were able to mobilize workers. Architecture thus became a mirror of social development. The artistic design also played a role. Walls of houses were sometimes painted with patterns, floors were smoothed or decorated with clay. Decorative elements made of bones, shells, or stones were integrated into the architecture. These details show that people not only erected functional buildings, but also developed aesthetic ideas. Architecture was not only protection, but also an expression of identity, status, and a sense of community. The differences between regions are remarkable. In Central Europe, longhouses dominated, in Southern Europe and the Middle East, mud brick architecture, and in Northern Europe, pile dwellings on lakes and rivers. Each region developed its own forms, adapted to climate, resources, and cultural traditions. This diversity shows that the architecture of the Stone Age was not uniform, but offered a wide range of solutions. In summary, architecture played a fundamental role in the Stone Age. It reflected the new ways of life of the sedentary people, created spaces for living, working, stockpiling, and religion. With it, villages, communities, and the first monuments were created that went far beyond the useful. It was an expression of a new relationship of man to space and time, to life and death. The architecture of the Stone Age laid the foundation for everything that would later become urban planning, monumental art, and civilization.
Chapter 14: Trade, Exchange, and Early Networks. With the sedentary lifestyle and the Neolithic way of life, not only a new era of agriculture and architecture began, but also the development of trade and exchange. Even in the days of hunters and gatherers, people had transported objects such as flint or jewelry over long distances. But with the sedentary lifestyle, the importance of such networks increased enormously. Agriculture and livestock breeding led to surpluses that could not only be used for personal use, but also exchanged. This gave rise to the first forms of economic relations that went far beyond the framework of a single community. The early trade goods of the Stone Age were mainly raw materials that were not available everywhere. Flint was one of the most important materials, as it allowed for sharp blades and tools.
Deposits of particularly high-quality flint became centers from which the material was spread over hundreds of kilometers. The same applies to obsidian, a volcanic glass that was found in certain regions and was particularly prized for its hardness and sharpness. Archaeological finds show that obsidian was traded over long distances as early as the Neolithic age, indicating complex networks. In addition to raw materials, shells, amber, and rare stones also played a role. They had less practical but symbolic value and served as jewelry or status symbols. Amber from the Baltic Sea, for example, found its way to Central Europe, which shows that extensive exchange relationships already existed in the Stone Age. These materials not only had aesthetic significance, but also stood for power, prestige, and belonging to certain social groups. With the beginning of agriculture, food itself became a commodity. Surpluses of grain, legumes, or livestock could be exchanged. This led to communities becoming dependent on each other, and a system of reciprocal relationships emerged. Trade was not only an economic process, but also a social one. It strengthened the bonds between groups, facilitated the exchange of knowledge, and served to avoid conflicts, as interdependence could promote peace. An important aspect of trade in the Stone Age was that it took place without money in today's sense. The exchange was direct: a sack of grain for tools, a piece of obsidian for cattle or jewelry. This form of barter required negotiation, trust, and fixed rules. In many cases, the exchange was embedded in social and ritual acts. Festivals, celebrations, or alliances provided the framework in which goods were exchanged and relationships cultivated. Trade was thus not only an economic act, but also a cultural one. The networks that developed in the Stone Age were surprisingly far-reaching. Archaeological finds of materials in regions where they did not occur naturally show that goods were transported over hundreds of kilometers. This was not necessarily done by individual traders, but by a chain system in which goods were passed from group to group. In this way, objects could travel long distances without the people involved having to travel long distances themselves. Trade also promoted the dissemination of ideas and technologies. New tools, ceramic forms, or cultivation methods spread along the networks and were adopted and adapted in different regions. The exchange of knowledge was just as important as the exchange of goods. In this way, an innovation that originated in a certain region could soon be used in far-flung areas. Trade was thus an engine of cultural progress and the spread of innovation. Social structures were also influenced by trade. Communities that had access to sought-after raw materials or were strategically located on trade routes were able to gain advantages. They developed positions of power that they played out within the networks. In this way, the first beginnings of economic inequality and hierarchy emerged, which later became fixed power structures in more complex societies. Trade was therefore not only an economic necessity, but also a means of social differentiation. Ritual and symbolic dimensions of trade should not be underestimated. Bartering was often embedded in religious rituals, in which gifts were understood not only as an economic, but also a spiritual exchange. Gifts could serve to strengthen alliances or secure peace between groups. In this sense, trade in the Stone Age was closely intertwined with cultural and religious practices. The transport techniques of the Stone Age were simple but effective. People carried goods on their backs or used sledges, boats, and later animals to move larger quantities. Rivers and coastlines in particular played a central role as trade routes, as they facilitated transport. Even in the Stone Age, waterways were the veins along which goods, ideas, and people moved. In summary, trade and exchange in the Stone Age were much more than just a means of obtaining raw materials. They created networks that connected people, disseminated knowledge, and strengthened social relationships. They enabled the exchange of goods, ideas, and cultural practices, laying the foundation for the complex economic systems of later times. The early networks of the Stone Age were the first threads of a web that has become increasingly dense in the course of history and finally led to the global interconnectedness of our world today.
Chapter 15: Social Hierarchies and First Forms of Power. Sedentary life, Agriculture and animal husbandry led not only to changes in material culture, but also to profound developments in social structures. While hunter-gatherer groups were predominantly egalitarian because possessions could hardly be accumulated permanently, in the Neolithic age there were clear differences between individual members of a community for the first time. With the possibility of storing food supplies, controlling herds of cattle, and cultivating land, the opportunity to accumulate wealth opened up. This wealth inevitably led to differences in power, prestige, and influence. It was the beginning of social hierarchies that were to become more and more entrenched in the millennia that followed. The basis for these changes lay in agriculture. Those who had fertile land or cattle could produce more food than others. Surpluses made it possible to barter, create dependencies, or employ workers. Over time, families or clans formed that controlled more resources and thus took a preeminent position. This supremacy was secured not only economically but also socially and religiously, as the powerful often acted as mediators between the community and the gods or spirits. Grave finds from the Neolithic age prove these differences. While some people were buried with simple grave goods, others were given elaborate graves with jewelry, weapons, or rare materials such as amber and obsidian. Such differences indicate a social stratification based on property and influence. Monumental tombs built for individuals or families are also indications of the emergence of an elite that wanted to make its power visible beyond death. With the emergence of hierarchies, the organization of communities also changed. Decisions were no longer made by consensus, but were influenced by leaders or advisors who enjoyed special authority because of their wealth or position. These leaders could take on tasks such as organizing construction projects, distributing food, or leading conflicts. This created a first form of political power that went beyond the purely family level. Religious ideas played an important role in the legitimation of this power. The leaders were often closely connected to religious functions. They were considered to be those who led rituals, made sacrifices, or communicated with the gods. In this way, their power was secured not only economically, but also spiritually. Religion and rule were closely intertwined from the beginning, and this connection was to become a central element of state order in the later advanced civilizations. The emergence of power structures also had an impact on the division of labor. With the surplus of food, individual members of the community were able to specialize. Craftsmen, potters, blacksmiths, or builders could train their skills, while others did the agricultural work. This specialization led to further differentiation within society. Those who had special skills enjoyed prestige, but those who had the resources ultimately determined the social framework. Conflicts over land and resources became increasingly an issue. While hunter-gatherer groups were relatively mobile and could move on when resources were scarce, sedentary communities were more tied to their land. The protection of fields and herds became a central task, and with it the need to regulate conflicts within and between groups. Leaders who could offer protection were given additional influence. Military skills and control over weapons became important factors in the formation of power. However, it would be wrong to think of the early hierarchies as rigid. Compared to later companies, they were still relatively flexible. Leaders have had to reaffirm their status time and time again through accomplishments, generosity, and religious functions. Those who shared food, organized festivals, or ensured the protection of the community consolidated their position. Power was based less on coercion than on recognition, but it laid the foundations for structures that were later secured by violence and institutional domination. The social differences are also reflected in everyday life. Rich families were able to build larger houses, wear more jewelry, and play a prominent role in rituals. They could employ workers or further consolidate their position through barter. At the same time, many people remained dependent on the resources of the powerful, which increased dependencies and inequality. The egalitarian world of hunter-gatherers was finally a thing of the past, and in its place came a world in which property and influence determined the social order. The monumental architecture was also an expression of these new hierarchies.
The construction of megalith sites, temples, or large settlements required an organization that would hardly have been possible without leadership. Elites were able to make their power visible through such construction projects and claimed to be at the center of the community. At the same time, these monuments had a religious and cultural significance that symbolically consolidated the social order. In summary, it can be said that the Neolithic age was not only characterized by technical and economic advances, but also by the emergence of social hierarchies and power structures. Ownership of land and livestock, control of surpluses, religious functions, and military capabilities were the foundations of this power. The early leaders were not kings in the later sense, but they laid the foundation for rule and social order. This was a decisive step. Equal communities became societies with social classes, power, and influence. This change shaped the further development of humanity and paved the way for the emergence of the first states and advanced civilizations.
Chapter 16: Megalithic Culture, Stone Circles, Dolmens, and Tombs. With the transition to the Neolithic age, not only did sedentariness, agriculture, and domestication of animals begin, but also the emergence of monumental architecture that went far beyond the needs of everyday life. The so-called megalithic cultures, which developed in many parts of Europe and beyond, are still visible testimonies to this enormous cultural step. Huge stones were moved, erected, and arranged in impressive structures that lasted for thousands of years. Stone circles, dolmens, passage tombs, and menhirs bear witness to a time when man began to erect monuments that had both religious and social significance. The word megalith means big stone and aptly describes the basis of these structures. Unlike the more practical houses or storehouses, megalithic sites did not serve daily survival, but had a symbolic, ritual, or religious function. They were places of remembrance, burial, cult, or community building. Their construction required an enormous joint effort because the stones, which weighed several tons, had to be transported over long distances, erected, and precisely arranged. Dolmens, also known as dolmens, are one of the most recognizable forms of megalithic architecture. They consist of several large stones that form a chamber, often closed with a capstone. Originally, these graves were covered with earth and formed mounds, the so-called tumuli. Dolmens served as burial sites for several people, often entire families or communities. The size and design of such sites suggest that they were not only burial sites, but also had a symbolic function. They connected the living with the dead, the present with the past, and the community with their ancestors. Passage graves represent another form. They consist of long corridors that lead to a central chamber. This construction method shows even greater planning and organization, as the arrangement of the stones was more complex. In many cases, the corridors were aligned according to astronomical aspects, so sunrises or sunsets fell exactly on the entrance on certain days of the year, such as the winter or summer solstice. This suggests that the megalithic structures were not only tombs, but also had calendar functions and were linked to the cycles of nature. Stone circles are another impressive testimony to megalithic cultures. The best-known example is Stonehenge in England, but similar circles can be found in many regions of Europe. They consist of erected stones that form a circle or other geometric shape. Here, too, there are indications of astronomical references, as certain stones can be associated with the positions of the sun or moon. Stone circles could have been meeting places, places of worship, or sacred spaces where rituals took place that structured the life of the community. Menhirs, individual erected stones, are the simplest form of megalithic monuments. They can be isolated or arranged in rows. Their function is not always clear, but they could have been boundary markers, memorial signs, or symbols for certain gods or ancestors. Some menhirs are engraved with weapons, symbols, or figures, underlining the importance of these stones. The erection of such monuments was a huge community effort. The transport and erection of stones weighing tons required planning, organization, and cooperation of many people. This suggests that Neolithic communities were able to coordinate large construction projects, which in turn indicates social hierarchies and leadership.
The monuments were thus not only an expression of faith and religion, but also of social order and collective identity. Megalithic culture also had a religious dimension that was closely linked to the notions of life, death, and fertility. The orientation of many buildings to the positions of the sun shows that people included the cycles of nature in their rituals. The sun represented life, growth, and renewal, and its annual return symbolized the eternal cycle of birth and death. The graves were therefore not only places of farewell, but also of hope for rebirth and continuity. Archaeological finds in the graves give us insights into the living environment. Grave goods such as ceramics, tools, jewelry, or animal bones show that the dead were equipped with things that they might need in the afterlife. This practice indicates a strong belief in life after death. At the same time, the grave goods reflect social differences, as some graves were richer than others. This makes it clear that the megalithic cultures were not organized in an egalitarian way, but already had clear hierarchies. The monuments were not only religious sites, but also social centers. They offered a place where the community could gather to perform rituals, celebrate festivals, or make important decisions. In this sense, they had an integrative function that strengthened cohesion and strengthened the identity of the community. They were visible symbols that had an impact far into the landscape and marked the community's claim to their territory. The fascination of megalithic cultures continues to this day. Many of these structures are still preserved, although their original meaning can no longer be fully reconstructed. They bear witness to an era in which people were able to erect buildings of impressive durability and symbolic power without metal tools, wheels, and modern technology. They show that the Stone Age was not only an era of survival, but also a time of great cultural achievements. In summary, it can be said that the megalithic cultures represent an outstanding chapter of the Neolithic age. With their stone circles, dolmens, passage tombs, and menhirs, people created monuments that went far beyond the functional and were deeply rooted in religion, society, and culture. They were an expression of faith, community, and power, and laid the foundations for the monumental architecture of later advanced civilizations. Even today, these stones remind us that the people of the Stone Age were not only survivors, but also creators of an enduring culture.
Chapter 17. Advances in Technology and Tools, from Stone to Metal. The Stone Age owes its name to the tools that were made of stone and formed the foundation of human survival for many millennia. But within this long epoch, the technology continued to develop. From rough-hewn scree tools to finely ground blades and complex composite tools, continuous progress has taken place that not only increased the efficiency of the work, but also reflects the mental abilities of humans. At the end of the Stone Age, the transition to metal finally began, opening a new era and ushering in the Bronze Age. This change was not abrupt, but the result of a long development in which innovation, experience, and cultural exchange worked together. The oldest tools of the Paleolithic age were simple striking devices that were created by splitting off a sharp edge from a stone. They could be used to cut meat, cut bones, or work wood. These tools were primitive, but they marked a decisive step in the incarnation of man, as they proved that humans did not just passively accept nature, but actively shaped it. Over time, more complex devices such as hand axes were created, which already show a deliberate design. They were universally applicable and are among the longest-lived inventions of mankind. In the course of the Middle and Neolithic periods, tools became more and more specialized. Scrapers, drills, blades, arrowheads, and spearheads were developed specifically for specific tasks. This specialization shows that people developed an ever deeper understanding of materials and their possible applications. Flint in particular played a prominent role, as it was ideal for making sharp blades due to its fracture structure. In regions where flint was not available, people used obsidian, quartzite, or other hard rocks. The targeted mining and widespread dissemination of such materials indicate that complex trade networks already existed.
A decisive advance was the technique of grinding and polishing. While in the Paleolithic age, tools were mainly formed by beating, in the Neolithic age it was possible to produce particularly smooth and sharp edges by rubbing and grinding. Axes and hatchets made of polished stone were not only more effective but also more durable than their unpolished predecessors. They could be used to clear forests, plant fields, and build houses, activities that were indispensable for the Neolithic way of life. Sharpened tools thus marked a great technical advance, which laid the foundation for agriculture and sedentary life. At the same time, composite tools developed. Stone blades were inserted into wooden shafts and fastened with resin, leather, or plant fibers. In this way, spears, arrows, sickles, or hammers were created, which enabled a greater range and power. In particular, the combination of bow and arrow revolutionized hunting, as it offered greater precision and safety. Such assembled tools show that people not only possessed manual dexterity, but also the ability to think and plan complexly. In addition to stone, other materials were increasingly used. Bones, antlers, and wood were used as raw materials for needles, harpoons, jewelry, or tools. This diversity makes it clear that people had a deep knowledge of the properties of different materials. They knew how to work on them, combine them, and use them for different purposes. With this experience, the creativity to develop new forms and techniques also grew. The transition to metal was a milestone in this development. As early as the late Neolithic age, metals such as copper were discovered and used, initially in their native form, i.e., as naturally occurring metal that could be shaped by hammering. These early copper objects were mostly pieces of jewelry or status symbols, and had less practical significance because they were softer than cut stone. But the discovery that metals are malleable laid the foundation for a new era. Over time, people learned to smelt ores and extract metals in a targeted manner. This was a technical revolution based on observation and experimentation. The smelting of copper, the production of casting molds, and finally the alloying of copper with tin to form bronze fundamentally changed tool production. Bronze was harder and more durable than stone and opened up new possibilities in agriculture, crafts, and warfare. The transition from stone to metal was therefore not only a technical advance, but a cultural upheaval that changed the entire society. But this transition was slow. Stone tools were used in parallel with metal for a long time, as they were easier to produce and metal was scarce in many regions. Metal tools only gradually became established, first in centers with access to raw materials and technological knowledge, and later also in more distant areas. This coexistence of stone and metal shows that technical developments take time to fully assert themselves. Advances in technology and tools have had a profound impact on all areas of life. In agriculture, larger areas could be worked and used more efficiently. In hunting, the success rate increased, and in architecture, more stable and larger structures were built. At the same time, the importance of craftsmen who had special knowledge and made tools or jewelry grew. This specialization led to further differentiation within society and strengthened the social hierarchies that had emerged in the Neolithic age. To sum up, the development of tools from coarse stone tools to the first metal objects is a reflection of the Earth's incarnation. It shows the path from simple survival strategies to complex technical knowledge and cultural innovation. Tools were not just practical tools, but expressions of intelligence, creativity, and social organization. With the transition to metal, a new epoch began, which laid the foundation for the later advanced civilizations. The history of tools is thus at the same time the history of civilization, a continuous process in which man learned to use nature's resources more and more purposefully for his purposes and thus to shape the world according to his ideas.
Chapter 18: Art and Culture in the Neolithic. The Neolithic age was not only an era of great technical and economic changes, but also a time of cultural flourishing. With sedentary life, agriculture, and the formation of social structures, a new form of art and culture emerged that differed from the forms of expression of the Paleolithic and Mesolithic ages.
While cave paintings and small figures dominated the artistic world in the Paleolithic age, a broader range of forms of expression developed in the Neolithic, which was closely linked to the new lifestyle. Art was not only used to depict animals or hunting scenes, but was increasingly integrated into everyday life, be it in ceramics, architecture, jewelry, or religious symbols. A central element of Neolithic art was ceramics. With the need to store supplies and transport food, pottery became an indispensable part of everyday life. But the vessels were not only functional, but also artistically designed. They were decorated with patterns, engravings, and paintings that showed geometric shapes, spirals, zigzag lines, or stylized representations of plants and animals. These decorations had not only aesthetic value, but often also symbolic meaning. They could have been protective symbols, religious signs, or expressions of belonging to a particular community. The diversity of ceramic styles in different regions of Europe and Asia shows that each culture developed its own artistic language. Jewelry also played an important role in the Neolithic. Beads made of shells, bones, animal teeth, or rare stones, such as amber, were processed into necklaces, bracelets, or amulets. Such pieces of jewelry served not only as personal decoration, but also as symbols of status, identity, or religious belief. Amber in particular, which was traded over long distances from the Baltic Sea region, had a high value and was often found in graves. Jewelry was thus also an expression of social differences and cultural connections. Architecture offered new opportunities for artistic expression. Walls of houses were painted, floors smoothed or decorated with patterns. Monumental buildings such as megalithic tombs or temples were engraved depicting spirals, circles, or figures. These symbols were closely linked to the religious ideas of the time and probably had a cultic meaning. Especially in the megalithic sites, there are indications that art was not just decoration, but part of a comprehensive worldview that combined life, death, nature, and the cosmos. The depiction of figures also remained an important element of Neolithic culture. While animal representations dominated in the Paleolithic age, anthropomorphic figures gained in importance in the Neolithic. Particularly common are depictions of female figures, which are interpreted as fertility goddesses. These statuettes may have symbolized the connection between man, nature, and fertility, and played a central role in religious rituals. But male figures, often in connection with hunting, power, or ancestor worship, have also been handed down. This diversity shows that people increasingly structured their world through symbols and representations. Music and dance were also part of the Neolithic culture, although direct evidence is rare. Finds of flutes made of bones, drums, or rattles indicate that music played a role in rituals, festivals, and everyday life. Dance, song, and rhythm were probably expressions of a sense of community, religious devotion, or ritual acts. Music was a universal language that connected people and expressed feelings long before writing was developed. Art in the Neolithic has always had a close connection to religion and ideology. Symbols on ceramics, engravings in megalithic sites, or figures were not merely decorative, but an expression of a belief system that revered nature, fertility, cycles, and ancestors. The people of the Neolithic age lived in close connection with nature, and this connection was reflected in their cultural expressions. Sun and moon cycles, the seasons, birth and death, all these themes found their place in art and shaped the cultural identity of the communities. The social dimension of art and culture should not be underestimated either. Works of art could clarify the status of a person or family, express belonging to a group, or make differences between communities visible. At the same time, they had an integrative function by accompanying rituals, decorating festivals, and strengthening cohesion. Culture was thus not only an individual expression, but also an instrument of social order. Cultural exchange played a major role in the development of Neolithic art. Through trade and networks, not only material spread, but also styles and symbols. Patterns that arose in one region appeared in a modified form in other regions. This shows that there was already some form of cultural communication across long distances. The people of the Neolithic age were not isolated groups, but part of a larger network in which ideas, symbols, and techniques were passed on. In summary, art and culture in the Neolithic were far more than mere ornaments or expressions of creativity. They were an integral part of life, closely linked to religion, society, and the economy. They reflected the new sedentary way of life, gave identity, strengthened cohesion, and opened up new forms of symbolic thinking. Neolithic art shows us that the people of this era were not only survivors, but also designers of a rich cultural world, the traces of which are still visible today.
Chapter 19, The End of the Stone Age, Transition to the Bronze Age. The end of the Stone Age does not mark an abrupt break, but a gradual transition that took place over centuries and millennia. This process was marked by new discoveries, technical innovations, and profound social changes, which finally led to the Bronze Age. While the Stone Age was characterized by tools and weapons made of stone, bone, and wood, the discovery and processing of metals opened up completely new possibilities. The introduction of copper and later bronze changed not only technology, but also trade, society, and culture. The transition to the Bronze Age was therefore more than a technological revolution. It was an upheaval that led humanity on a path that would lead to the emergence of advanced civilizations, cities, and early states. The first steps towards metalworking began as early as the late Neolithic age, when people came across naturally occurring native copper. This metal could be shaped by hammering and was initially used mainly for jewelry and prestige objects. Its softness made it less suitable for tools and weapons, but it had a symbolic meaning that went beyond practical use. The possession of metal objects gave prestige and power, as they were rare and valuable. With the discovery of the smelting of copper ores, a new era began. People found that they could extract copper from rock by heating it in furnaces. This innovation required a deep understanding of fire, temperature control, and materials. It shows how much people's technical knowledge had expanded during this time. The molten copper could be used to cast more complex shapes, and the production of tools and weapons became possible. The decisive breakthrough came with the alloying of copper with tin to bronze. Bronze was harder and more durable than pure copper or self-cut stone. It was ideal for tools, weapons, and jewelry, and opened up completely new possibilities. Bronze blades could be used to work fields more efficiently, clear forests faster, and fight enemies more effectively. Bronze was a material that increased efficiency and at the same time represented a symbol of progress and power. The spread of bronze also changed social structures. Since tin, unlike copper, was only found in a few regions, a wide-ranging trade was established to bring together the raw materials for the alloy. This led to greater networking of communities, but also to dependencies. Regions with access to copper or tin deposits gained importance and power. Control over these resources led to the first beginnings of political and economic dominance, which laid the foundation for more complex societies. With the end of the Stone Age and the beginning of the Bronze Age, the culture also changed. Graves from this era show a growing social differentiation. Rich graves with weapons, jewelry, and metal objects are contrasted with simple burials without special grave goods. These differences reflect a society in which property, power, and prestige were unevenly distributed. Hierarchies that had begun in the Neolithic age continued to solidify and led to a new social order. The architecture also continued to develop. While megalithic buildings and simple villages dominated in the Stone Age, larger settlements with fortifications that offered protection now emerged. The increasing importance of trade and resources led to conflict, and the need to defend against attack grew. Bronze weapons reinforced this dynamic as they made warfare more effectively. Violence and power became central factors that shaped society.
Art and religion also adapted to the new zeitgeist, and metal was used not only for tools and weapons, but also for artistic jewelry and ritual objects. Sun symbols, spirals, and geometric patterns gained prominence, reflecting the close connection between cycles of nature, religion, and society. Metal offerings found in rivers, lakes, or tombs suggest that metal had a special spiritual significance. It was not just a material, but a medium associated with divine powers. Despite these innovations, the Stone Age remained present for a long time. Stone tools continued to be used in many regions because they were easier to produce and raw materials such as flint were available everywhere. The coexistence of stone and metal shows that technological developments did not take place everywhere at the same time and that tradition and innovation coexisted. It was only in the course of time that metalworking fully prevailed and displaced the old materials. The transition to the Bronze Age marked the end of an epoch that had encompassed most of human history. For hundreds of thousands of years, stone tools had dominated people's lives, and now a new material was taking their place. This change was not only of a technical nature, but also culturally, socially, and politically of enormous importance. It led to stronger networking, new hierarchies, growing inequality, but also to an upswing in culture, art, and innovation. In summary, the end of the Stone Age was a process in which old traditions were slowly replaced by new technologies. It was not an abrupt end, but a gradual transition that varied from region to region. But in its whole, it marks the beginning of a new era in which metal determined people's lives and laid the foundation for the great advanced civilizations of the Bronze Age. The Stone Age ended, but its legacy remained alive in the tools, the structures, the art, and the social structures it had produced, and it continues to shape the history of humanity to this day.
Chapter 20. Aftermath of the Stone Age, Heritage and Significance for Humanity. When we look back at the Stone Age today, we are looking at an epoch that encompassed most of human history and laid the foundations for everything that was to come after. For hundreds of thousands of years, people lived in this era, developing tools, art, language, and social structures. The Stone Age was not a primitive, chaotic time, but the decisive phase in which man learned to live with nature, to shape it, and finally to grow beyond it. Her legacy is still felt in many ways today, even though the world has changed dramatically since then. The Stone Age initially left behind the fundamental technical knowledge that formed the basis for later developments. The invention and further development of tools made of stone were not only practical achievements, but also an expression of the human ability to plan, construct, and innovate. This ability to make tools from raw materials and adapt them to changing needs is a common thread that runs through the entire history of mankind. Without the early tools of the Stone Age, later metalworking or even modern technology would not have been conceivable. Fire, which was tamed in the Stone Age, is also a symbol of the beginning of culture and civilization to this day. With it, humans began to actively control their environment, to generate heat and light, to preserve food, and to protect themselves against danger. Fire was not just a tool, but a cultural medium that created community and shaped rituals. Even today, fire plays a symbolic role in religions, festivals, and traditions. The social organization that developed in the Stone Age also shapes humanity to the present day. Living in small communities, the division of labor between men and women, sharing food, and developing rules for living together were the first steps toward more complex societies. Many of the values that we consider fundamental today, solidarity, cooperation, responsibility for others, have their roots in the Stone Age. At the same time, in the Neolithic age, sedentary life and agriculture created the basis for social differences, property, and power, which are still central elements of human societies today. Culturally, the Stone Age was an era of great creativity. The cave paintings, figures, jewelry, and megalithic buildings show that art did not only begin in later advanced civilizations, but is deeply rooted in human history. These works are not only aesthetically impressive, but also an expression of symbolism, religion, and identity. They prove that people thought beyond themselves early on, interpreted their world, and put their ideas into lasting forms. The connection between art and religion which emerged in the Stone Age runs like a thread through the entire history of cultures. Sedentary life and the Neolithic Revolution mark perhaps the most important legacy of the Stone Age. With them began the transition from a nomadic to a sedentary way of life, from hunter-gatherers to farmers and cattle breeders. This change changed everything: nutrition, work, social structures, religion, and culture. It made surpluses possible, led to trade and specialization, and laid the foundation for cities, states, and civilizations. Without this step, the world as we know it would not have come into being. The monuments of the Stone Age also have a lasting significance. Dolmens, stone circles, and tombs are still visible testimonies to an era that was deeply connected to nature, religion, and community. They show that people have had the desire to create lasting places that have significance beyond their own lives from an early age. These monuments are not only archaeological relics, but also cultural symbols that remind us that man has always sought meaning, order, and transcendence. The heritage of the Stone Age is not only material, but also spiritual. Language, symbolic thinking, and the ability to form abstract ideas developed during this era. They made it possible to pass on knowledge across generations, to tell myths and stories, and to build complex social structures. These mental abilities are the very foundation of human culture and civilization. Without them, the development of writing, science, or philosophy would not have been conceivable. Traces of the Stone Age can also be seen in modern everyday life. Many of the foods we use today can be traced back to plants and animals that were domesticated in the Neolithic age. The idea of community, family, and division of labor is a legacy of this era. Even our fascination with fire, nature, and ritual has its roots in the experiences of early humanity. In this sense, the Stone Age lives on in us, not only in artifacts, but in our ways of thinking, habits, and traditions. The end of the Stone Age and the transition to the Bronze Age was not a conclusion, but a new beginning. The achievements of the Stone Age formed the foundation on which later cultures could build. They laid the foundations for technology, society, religion, and culture, which continued to develop in the Bronze and Iron Ages, in the advanced civilizations of antiquity, and finally in the modern world. The Stone Age was thus not a primitive preliminary stage, but the decisive starting point of human civilization. In summary, the Stone Age is not simply a distant closed epoch, but an integral part of our history and identity. It shaped the foundations of humanity and left behind a legacy that continues to have an impact today. Whether in our tools, in our social structures, in our art, or in our myths, the traces of the Stone Age are everywhere. They remind us of how far we have come, but also of how much we are connected to our origins today. The Stone Age is therefore not only the past, but a living part of our present and future.